Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act just once with beauty and courage. Perhaps everything that frightens us is, in its deepest essence, something helpless that wants our love. These were the words of Rainer Maria Rilke, who was an Austrian poet. He lived between 1875 up until 1926, and whose letters are studied today as rich philosophical reflections. I recently picked up from him his letters to a young poet, and as I was reading this book, I found myself continuously underlining and scribbling in the book, taking away a lot of life lessons. And so in today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you some of my takeaways from his work. These particular letters are addressed to a poet, and so a lot of the advice that Rilke is sharing is really more tailored towards artists. But the takeaways that I'm going to be sharing today are takeaways that I was able to translate into more type of life lessons. Most of the life lessons that I will be discussing today are derived from this particular work from his, but I'm also going to complement a few of the life lessons with some inspiration from The Dark Interval, which is also a collection of his letters that he wrote particularly towards people who were dealing with a lot of grief and loss in their lives. And this particular collection I read a few years back. The very first lesson that Rilke shares with us in his letters to a young poet is that we have to look inward and seek answers within ourselves. The very beginning of the collection starts with a young poet reaching out to Rilke as a figure of authority, a figure of extensive knowledge in the field of poetry and literature, and he's asking Rilke for some advice on his poetry. He's asking him, "This is my poetry, do you think it's any good? Do you have any feedback for me?" And Rilke's reply in the very first letter is extremely shocking. He says, "Stop asking other people if the work you're doing is good." And this doesn't really come from a place of arrogance in the sense that other people's opinions don't matter or what other people have to say has no value, but rather because for Rilke, the real meaning of whether something is valuable, whether something is successful, is really relying more on how honest you are with yourself about the things that you want to accomplish. So for all of these lessons, I'll be reading from the actual letters so that you can actually visualize with a couple of excerpts what I'm talking about. When I'm going to be reading from the letters of a young poet, I'm going to be reading in French and then putting the translations in English because this particular collection that I've read from him was in French. And then when I'm going to be reading from The Dark Interval, I'm going to be reading English because I read it in English. So Rilke tells the young poet the following. Votre regard est tourné vers l'extérieur et c'est d'abord cela que vous ne devriez désormais plus faire. Personne ne peut vous conseiller ni vous aider, personne. Il n'existe qu'un seul moyen. Plongez en vous-même, recherchez la raison qui vous enjoint d'écrire. Examinez si cette raison étend ses racines jusqu'aux plus extrêmes profondeurs de votre cœur. Répondez franchement à la question de savoir si vous seriez condamné à mourir au cas où il vous serait refusé d'écrire. So really, Rilke here, it's pointing towards something very important that I found to be valuable in my own work. I'm not an artist, but I found that this philosophical approach to looking at the things that you are creating, whether that's in your professional life or in personal life, and examining it through a lens of authenticity. Does the work that you are putting out there tell the real story? Does the work that you are putting out there reflect who you actually are? Does it reflect the full extent of your capabilities, of your skills? Is it something that you could tell yourself you're proud of? And you may think these are stupid questions to ask, but if you actually sit down with yourself after you've done something that is difficult or you've completed one of your tasks, you sit down with yourself and you ask yourself all of those questions in a very honest way, you will find that most of the time the answer is actually no. I'm a researcher, so I have to write academic papers oftentimes. So when I actually sat down with myself and actually asked these questions about a piece of writing that I had been working on, the answer would be no. I don't think this reflects fully my capabilities. I don't think I was honest enough or I've struggled enough in this particular section to put forward what I wanted to put forward. Sitting with those very uncomfortable questions actually allowed me to dig deeper and to find answers to questions I didn't even know I had about my work. And I think this also speaks to a deeper issue that we have in our society about the trap of validation. Seeking validation externally is a very double-edged sword. sword, because if you get it, you're going to be on cloud nine. You're going to be happy, you're going to be excited, you're going to be motivated to work more. But if the outcome is negative, that's going to completely demotivate you. Sure, some people might say, if you get negative feedback, you can internalize it and work from it. But a lot of people have difficulty untangling their emotional reactions towards negative feedback and actually visualizing it as a piece of constructive criticism. So Rilke is saying, stop giving authority to other people around you to tell you whether something you're doing is good, and just look internally and be very honest with yourself. A second life lesson from Rilke is that we have to cherish solitude. We tend to frame solitude either as some sort of luxury, so we use solitude as a resting time when we are freed from our productive routines and we have time to sit down and just relax, or we see it as something negative, something that is antisocial or that has a negative connotation of loneliness. Rilke is saying that solitude is actually a very important piece of the puzzle for our personal development as human beings. For Rilke, solitude has a very kind of mystical superpower, and by engaging with solitude, there's a special kind of transcendence that happens where we get to explore the limits of who we are, the limits of our thoughts. Just think about the last time that you sat with yourself with absolutely zero distractions. You just sat either to think or to reflect, or even trying to not think about anything, just sitting there. We constantly have a phone open, we constantly have someone to talk to. If there's no one around, we can just put on the TV. If we're feeling tired, we're either going to doom scroll or we're going to take on a hobby. There's constantly something that occupies our mind, even if it's something that is seemingly not taking a lot of energy. And so Rilke is saying we need to trust solitude and we need to really engage with it, because there's something special that happens in those moments when we allow ourselves to just be. In one of the later letters, he writes, On peut seulement souhaiter que vous laissez patiemment et en toute confiance cette grandiose solitude accomplir en vous son travail. Solitude qui ne pourra plus jamais être effacée de votre existence et qui, dans tout ce que vous aurez à vivre et à réaliser, agira continuellement et de manière discrètement décisive, telle une influence anonyme, un peu comme en nous le sang de nos ancêtres court sans cesse et se fond avec le nôtre pour produire un composé unique qui ne se répétera jamais, ce que nous sommes à chaque tournant de notre vie. For Rilke, solitude is something that is a constant in our lives, that once we allow it to seep into ourselves and we allow ourselves to exist in solitude, its influence is actually limitless. And alongside this theme of solitude, the third lesson from Rilke is that we have to do things that are hard. In the very same way that he argues solitude is something that you have to allow to happen for you to be able to transcend into someone better, in the same way we have to do things that are hard and challenging so that we can arrive at a better version of ourselves. So in the dark interval, he recounts a time when he had a brief interaction with someone who was a suicide victim. And this person had been going through difficult moments in their life. And Rilke is recounting how he reflected on that interaction and what he took away from it. From that moment on, I have known with certainty that the worst things and even despair are only a kind of abundance and an onslaught of existence that one decision of the heart could turn into its opposite. Where things become truly difficult and unbearable, we find ourselves in a place already very close to its transformation. I have learned from my mom to never quit anything that I start. And this is how I approach life. But that leads me to deal with a lot of challenging things, because it happens oftentimes that I don't see the purpose in something. I don't find it meaningful to continue a certain journey or a certain life path, but I do it anyways because I started it. And you might think this is a toxic way to deal with life, but I've found that every single time that I reached that moment of pure despair and I was feeling like it's the most challenging thing I've ever had to do because I don't believe in it anymore, every single time without any exception, I came out of that experience on the other end as a transformed person. I've learned something about myself. I've learned something about what I can do and what I cannot do, about how I can deal with certain things that now I've experienced that I hadn't experienced in the past. And every single time it was a transformative experience. And I was able, after the fact, to view it as a life lesson that is meaningful and that I cherish and I value. and that has brought something to me, even if in those moments it was just pure despair and it felt like nothing mattered. And to go back to the very quote that I started this video with, I read it in English and now I'm going to be reading it from the book in French. Peut-être tous les dragons de notre vie sont-ils des princesses qui n'attendent que le moment de nous voir un jour beaux et courageux. Peut-être tout ce qui est effrayant est-il au fond ce qui est désemparé et qui requiert notre aide. I think this is one of the most beautiful passages of this book, and it really provides a different perspective on challenges in your life. It kind of personifies the challenges in your life as dragons, who are really just princesses in disguise, essentially suggesting that these challenges are not your enemy. They're just underdeveloped parts of yourself that you need to overcome, and the only way to overcome them is to go through the things that are difficult. The fourth lesson that I wanted to share with you is a bit more abstract, I would say, in the way that he describes it, or at least in the way that I interpreted it, and that's to connect with nature. For Rilke, nature is a teacher. Nature communicates something essential about who we are as people, and for Rilke, nature is truly the ultimate point of inspiration. And he even goes as far to say in, I think it was either the first letter or the first couple letters, that if you as an artist are unable to capture anything beautiful in your work, that's your failure, because there's so much beauty in the nature around us. The beauty is limitless, and we just need to find the appropriate lens through which to capture it. Si votre vie quotidienne vous paraît pauvre, ne l'accusez pas. Accusez-vous plutôt. Dites-vous que vous n'êtes pas assez poète pour en convoquer les richesses. Pour celui qui crée, il n'y a pas en effet de pauvreté ni de lieu indifférent. In the dark interval, he goes even a step further, and he views the relationship that we as humans have with nature as an obligation to capture and to fully investigate. He says, but even we ourselves, in our longing for a beyond away from here, become in that process less concrete and less earthbound, while it's our obligation, as long as we are here and related to tree, flower, and soil, to remain earthbound in the purest sense, and even yet to become so. I don't have much else to add for this particular lesson. For me, it's very meaningful because I love nature. I'm a huge nature lover and I love animals in particular. And I think that Rilke actually wrote quite a few poems on these topics. So I'm really interested to actually continue my exploration of nature through Rilke's works. The last lesson that I wanted to talk about that I took from Rilke is that time and timelines are irrelevant. We are constantly obsessed with timelines. We're like, okay, by the time I'm 20, I have to have my degree. By the time I'm 25, I have to be married. By the time I'm 30, I have to have kids and a house. And we are constantly just living in the future and we're not really sitting with the present. To me, this is very reminiscent from Stoicism. Be present, be with yourself in the moment. Time is an illusion. In one of the letters, he tells the young poet to stop asking so many questions and to instead just live with the questions that he's asking. I think this is another one of very famous quotes from the book. Vous êtes si jeune, en quelque sorte, avant tout début, et je voudrais aussi bien que je le puis vous prier, cher monsieur, d'être patient à l'égard de tout ce qui dans votre cœur est encore irrésolu, et de tenter d'aimer les questions elles-mêmes, comme des pièces closes et comme des livres écrits dans une langue fort étrangère. Ne cherchez pas pour l'instant des réponses qui ne sauraient vous être données, car vous ne seriez pas en mesure de les vivre. Or, il s'agit précisément de tout vivre. Vivez maintenant les questions. So he's really advocating here for trusting the process and going along with the process rather than living in a constant anxiety about the future or about everything that seems to be up in the air in your life in the moment. In the dark interval, he actually argues that the linearity of someone's life is irrelevant because we keep existing within the memories, within the objects, within the things that we leave behind, whether that's a piece of writing, whether that's a photograph, our essence, our thoughts, the things that we want to leave behind, they're not tied to a specific point in time. And so he writes to someone who has lost someone. Does the person who passes away not leave all the things he had begun in hundreds of ways to be continued by those who outlive him, if they had shared any kind of inner bond at all? In recent years, I had to live through so many close experiences of death, but not one person has been taken from me without my having found the tasks around me increased. So he's arguing for this kind of circularity of life, that we keep existing in the things that we leave behind, and the people that outlive us will take on those things and continue our project. So these are the 5 lessons that I found to be most striking from Rilke's Letter to a Young Poet, that I also found to be echoing pretty well what he was talking about in his Dark Interval. Of course, there's so many other beautiful philosophical reflections that Rilke is sharing with us. So if you've read his work and you have other beautiful reflections to share, please leave them down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.